Good afternoon, everyone. I think the conference schedulers planned this panel specifically to rouse everyone out of their post-lunch stupor with a topic that I'm sure no one in this room has strong thoughts or feelings about. And so we're going to dive into the discussion about the October 7th attacks and its consequences and all the dynamics that have played out since then. The attacks had immediate consequences we know of. They have consequences that we're watching play out in real time, and there are consequences we haven't yet seen or know about. So I thought that I would begin with this esteemed group to go down the panel to ask each in their mind what is, if not the most, what is a significant or one of the most significant consequences of what we've seen since October 7th in terms of shaping the region, shaping Israel, shaping the views of Palestinians, and we'll have a diversity of viewpoints in this panel. So we'll start with Diana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you also to my co-panelists. What has changed? Everything. I think it's important to take us back to where we were at the end of September of 2023. And the reason I say that is, if you think back to the end of September of 2023, for Palestinians, we were in a space where the world had largely ignored us. The world was now talking about normalization. The siege and blockade on Gaza had been complete, with nobody really doing anything about it. There had been a number of Palestinians killed, 400, from the beginning of 2023 up until that time. And the Israeli government was continuing with its policies as usual. Diplomats were telling me that Palestine was not even within the top 10 of issues. When we fast forward and look today, we can see that the implications have become deep. Palestine is now a place where the world's attention is now turned. We see that capitals around the world, that there are demonstrations against Israel's genocide. And we see now that people are now no longer looking at this through the lens of conflict resolution, of conflict management, but instead recognizing and understanding that we must get to the root cause, which is the 76-year denial of freedom of Palestinians. And so much has changed. We're also seeing on US campuses, for example, that the younger generation is now mobilized in a way that they have never been mobilized in the past. And there is now a very deep understanding and recognition that this cannot continue. I'm going to leave the rest for my other panelists, but I'm sure we're going to get back to this, and thank you.
Yes. Let me be personal for a moment, at least. On the 7th of October, it was a Saturday, I was jogging in the park next to my home. I'm jogging very slowly. At 6:30, there was a siren. I thought it might be some mistake. 10 minutes later, there was another siren. There was nowhere to go in the park. I went home. I went still to the swimming pool. At the swimming pool, there were already signs, where is the shelter? And then I came, and they asked me to go out of the water because something horrible is happening. I came home, I saw the images from Sderot with those Toyota pickup trucks moving in Sderot. My natural Israeli arrogance made me think that this is from Afghanistan or from somewhere else. I couldn't believe that this is happening. My first reaction, I'll be very frank with you, was, oh, that's the Berlin Wall falling now. And when I saw those streams of people on bicycles, on motorcycles, crossing the fence, which I was following for so many years, I said, that's the Berlin Wall is falling in front of our eyes. And I must tell you, very frankly, I had also some kind of joy to see that the fences of the biggest jail in the world are falling down. And I wrote, Saturday is the day that I'm writing my pieces for Sunday, and I wrote something in this spirit, that the fences of Berlin are falling now in front of our eyes. And a few hours later, my editor called me and said, listen, terrible things are happening in the south. You cannot say it. It's not the Berlin Wall which fell because there were so many crimes taking place in the south. People were murdered, houses were burned, terrible things are taking place. Now we are almost 8 months later. Nothing looks like before 8 months. Israel didn't gain anything from this war. The situation of Israel today, after 8 months of mass killing of thousands and tens of thousands of Palestinians, most of them innocent people, Israel is in its worst position ever. And I'm speaking as an Israeli. Hamas is stronger than ever. Israel is weaker than ever. Israel became a pariah state like never before. Economy, self-estimation, everything was changed in Israel. The first shock of Israelis from what happened on the 7th, and on the 7th there were crimes committed. We have to face it. And I suggest all of us who are, I guess, at least in this hall, people of conscience and people who are fighting for the freedom of the Palestinians, realize that on the 7th there were crimes committed. But those crimes never will justify what Israel had done ever since then. Most of the Israelis, we have to face it, support this war. Most of the Israelis feel that after what happened on the 7th, Israel has the right to do whatever it wants, without any limits, not legal limits, not moral limits, nothing. And this war, with its 35,000 Palestinians killed, or maybe it's a little bit less, does it really matter, is the biggest stain on Israel ever since it was established. We are standing today in a position in which nobody knows how to get out. Israel went to this war without any kind of clue how to get out of this war. It was a war of revenge, a revenge over children, a revenge over women, a revenge over innocent people. And Israel is going to pay a hell of a price for this war. But the real price, I don't have to say it here, are the Palestinians of Gaza, who again pay a price again and again for Israel arrogance, for Israel feeling that it can do whatever it wants, for the feeling of Israel that we are the chosen people and the international law doesn't apply to us. It's a wonderful thing, but not for Israel. And they are also victims of Hamas, and this must be also being said here. Hamas, who went to this war without preparing shelters, hospitals, some kind of defense to their people. I don't argue the right of Palestinians to fight for their freedom. Nobody can argue it. But prepare your people, protect your people before you go to such an adventure. And here we stand today with all those enormous victims in Gaza. And when I watch Al Jazeera or any kind of other international networks, I can tell you, I deeply feel ashamed of being an Israeli.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Thank you very much. Happy to be here with such a distinguished group of people in such a distinguished place. My sense is that I have a list of like 7 or 8 things that I thought were significant, but I'll summarize them in one major, as Mark asked, the major development that I feel happened on and after October 7. And that major development was the beginning of the end of colonialism. The Palestinian struggle for self-determination is the last anti-colonial battle in the world. That's one reason why most of the world supports the Palestinians. The Israelis they're the last 19th century white European colonial venture that still is expanding, taking land, killing people, subjugating indigenous people, and doing all the things that colonialism has done. This is the turning point where the end of colonialism is near, and a new vision of a world where people can live together with equal rights, and that includes Israelis and Palestinians and others, is possibly a vision we can start thinking about. And when I say that this is the beginning of the end of colonialism for the Israelis, Israel was not defeated, or is not being defeated, only by the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, who for 100 years, since the mandate in 1923, for 100 years, Palestinians have never given up. And they finally had this breakthrough on October 7, despite the negative parts of it. They had this breakthrough that shattered not just the Israeli sense of military invincibility, but it also coincided with the shattering of all of the other pillars that have defined Israel and Zionism for the last 100 years. And we see this happening today. We see it in the Western world in particular. The mass media in the Western world, which I monitor closely and write about, is going through a very difficult period where the mainstream media is slowly dwindling because of the lack of a good business model. And the mainstream media in most Western countries, especially the United States, tends to mirror government policy, the American government, which mirrors Israeli policy. That is starting to change a little bit, slowly. These changes don't happen quickly, but it's beginning to happen. The more significant thing is that there is no longer one mainstream media, as there historically has always been in the United States. You have at least 3 media. You have the mainstream, the networks and the big papers and stuff. You have the progressive media, websites and other services that give you much more honest, complete information about the reality of the situation. And more importantly, you have the social media. And it's the social media that has really given the big blow to Zionist Israeli hegemony in the public relations and propaganda realm. Every single deed or statement that comes out of Israel, officials now, is immediately challenged by the alternative media and by the social media. The social media now gives people all over the world an immediate eye into Gaza. They can see what Zionism and Israel are doing today. After 100 years of dominance, they're acting in a savage way, mirroring the savagery of the concept of going into a land in the 1920s that was 93% Palestinian Arab and claiming it to make their own Jewish state. A savagery that was allowed by and aided by the United Kingdom back then, and today the savagery in the genocidal attack is aided by the United States and the United Kingdom. So these trends are all starting to fragment and shatter. The youth in the Western world, especially in the United States, predominantly get their news from the social media and the alternative media. They don't get it from the mainstream media anymore. And this is why you have this incredible youth movement, which started to assert itself 3-4 years ago in public opinion polls and in demonstrations and other things, and really came out this year in the college encampments, And this is a reflection of the fact that the trend in demographic and political sentiment across the Western world is in favor of Palestinian rights and against continued settler colonial Zionist hegemony. Israel is losing because most of the time when the name Israel is mentioned around the world, you'll almost always, not always, but almost always have it associated with either apartheid or settler colonialism or ethnic cleansing or genocide. These are now common terms used to describe Israel. There's no country in the world that can withstand that kind of change in its status around the world. Any act that the Israelis or the Zionist lobby does in the United States, which I monitor most because I'm there, any act that tries to turn off Palestinian voices or exclude them is immediately challenged in the public realm, demonstrations in the street, in the media, and in the courts. This is unprecedented. Never before has Palestinian nationalism faced up to Zionist colonialism on an equal basis. And they are on an equal basis. The realm of military might, Israel dominates, and the realm of support from big Western powers, especially UK and US, Israel still predominates there, but in every other realm, any action by not only Israel, but also now by the Biden administration is challenged in court, and not just the International Court of Justice, local courts, national courts. So in every respect, the fact is clear now that Zionism is, and Israel that came out of Zionism in its present form is being challenged and must be contained and defined. That if there is an Israeli state that lives with the Palestinians peacefully, according to international requirements of dealing with the refugees, getting out of the occupied lands, etc., then you can have a Zionism that is contained and defined and is not a settler colonial aggressive genocidal kind of process. So the fact is that Israel and Zionism on October 7 started to realize that they were being defeated not just by the response of some Palestinians, but they were being defeated by the passage of time. Because after a century, it became clear through social media, through investigative reporting, through all kinds of and activism by Palestinians and others, and some Israelis, some of whom are with us here on the stage, that people we've spoken about this for us for 50 years and before us for 50 years. Finally, we see a global momentum that speaks for Palestinian rights. There's no other issue in the world, none that I know of, that gets as much international, regular, active support as the Palestine rights issue does. And this is what we're seeing today. So this is a huge combination of factors and dynamics that will play themselves out in the coming months and years. The missing element is that the Palestinians don't have a government, a credible, legitimate government. And this is something we have to resolve, which we will. But once that's done, I think you're going to find a really serious new phase of hopefully intensive diplomacy to resolve the conflict at its root causes in a way that is fair to everybody. And then we can firmly say that the colonial era has finally ended.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, along with my colleagues. What has changed since October is the question. And I think for me, as a Palestinian in exile, as a filmmaker, I can see it clearly that everything has changed. The way that my generation fought for Palestine was by being polite and trying to explain what our problem was, what the occupation was, and how we could get what we needed, what we wanted, which is not just freedom but justice, in a very polite way. What happened as a result of October is that the new generations woke up, realized that the old way did not work, that this is a conflict which cannot be resolved by being polite and nice and kind, but that we have to go to the international stage. Many years and generations of education, of interaction quietly in educational institutions, in the press, through films and culture, finally started to pay off. And all that talking that we had done actually resulted in making people more aware. And it was like a jolt. It was like being cajolted into reality that we needed to fight to be equal, to be heard, and to have justice. A lot has been said about why the international media wasn't let into Gaza and that it did not allow for good reporting. I'd like to propose that it's actually the contrary. The fact that Gazans were able to report firsthand, not just through the few media organizations working on the ground, which of course was led by Al Jazeera and a few others, but the fact that there were so many social media actors on the ground that were able to take us live into the areas being bombed, into the hospitals, into the homes, in every inch of Gaza, actually made people witness to the crimes and the genocide that were being perpetrated. And I think this is actually one of the major results of what happened, that we all became witnesses. And as a result, it galvanized not just the sleepy Palestinians in diaspora, of which there are possibly up to 15 million, but the whole world community. Young people, older people, Jewish people, Arab people, white people, black people, the whole world was galvanized as a result of being witness to these atrocities. We see it, we saw it live every day. And I think this is the major result of what has happened. We became witness, and thus we are forced to act.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. First, allow me to thank our gracious hosts, the Soufan Center. Colin Clark is moderating a tremendous event. Thank you to the Qatari government for its support. These are really challenging and painful times, and it's hard for me as someone who works in the Middle East to think of a more challenging and painful topic. There's really very little that evokes more emotion than the subject of this conflict. And strangely, we're living in a time where virtually everyone has a platform to share their views and thoughts. And yet I also think we're living at a time where most people are frustrated because they feel like they're not heard. And so I sit here hearing, I sit here hoping to share some views that I have heard, my views, views of others, as dispassionately as I can, and I do that because I'm not a cold person, but because my best effort is to be able to portray an analytic perspective that can hopefully drive to better outcomes. I'll talk a little bit first about where we were pre-October. There's been a bipartisan policy, I think, in Washington. We've seen this arc of an attempt to integrate the Middle East region in a host of ways. most pronounced with the integration of Israel into the region. We saw this with the last administration's Abraham Accords. We saw this continue with this administration. The National Defense Strategy was very explicit. When you get to the section on the Middle East, page 40-something, it really talks very much about building the capabilities and the interoperability and the partnerships in the Middle East to offset some of the requirements that the U.S. will have in other priority regions of the world. And I think that very much was the thinking of the administration for the better part of the first 2 years. If you go back to September, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had released a piece in Foreign Affairs talking about the success of that strategy. And of course, shortly thereafter, a lot of people sort of mocked Jake's piece, saying, look, you couldn't have been more wrong. This isn't a very peaceful time in the region. You haven't been successful. Look at what has transpired. And I'm not an apologist for this administration. I'm not a voice for this administration. But I'll say I think it's a little unfair in that if the U.S. is sitting across from a chessboard from its adversaries, the U.S. made moves, and some of those adversaries made moves in no small part to undermine the purpose of the U.S. And so I think when we think of the actions that Hamas took on October 7th, it was to arrest some of this trend of seeing Israel integrate into the region. And now it's a question of, will Hamas be successful, or will that trend continue? Part of the discussion that was occurring in September, really at the time, was what is the magic amount of Israel-Palestinian conflict peace process yeast we need to be sprinkling onto the dough of normalization to make it rise, to make the bread rise? And I think where we sit now is the administration has sought to reverse that equation and work to pull Israel's normalization into the region, most prominently now with talks of Saudi Arabia, through the eye of the needle of an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, which at the best of circumstances is going to be incredibly, incredibly challenging. In some respects, this is an effort to broaden the problem, to bring in outside partners, regional partners, European partners, Asian partners, to help foment a solution, to help structure and buffet a process that could lead to two states for two peoples. But there are a lot of challenges underway. So a little bit about the U.S. policy post October 7th. It's very clear that the priority for the Biden administration was to ensure that Israel had what it needed to defend itself against from Hamas. And I think it's important to note, now that we're more than half an hour into this segment, that on October 7th, 1,200 people were killed and 250 people were taken hostage, including dozens of Americans killed, and there remain 128 hostages in Gaza, 8 of whom were Americans. So providing for Israel's defense was and remains a key U.S. priority. Beyond that, the second priority was stemming the opportunity for other actors in the region to take advantage and escalate and broaden this conflict. This was most pronounced with President Biden's speech of don't. Then, enable as much humanitarian support for the Palestinians as possible. Reduce and mitigate civilian harm, and create conditions where Palestinian lives are preserved. Obviously, this has been a challenging process. We can talk a little bit about some of the perspectives in the region among Israelis. I think, Gideon presents one perspective. I think there are a panoply of views which really don't get represented very well in the public. But I'll say a little bit about what occurred maybe in the public space in the days following October. It's true there was a tremendous amount of social media activity, which is representative of the time we're in, but also potentially very destructive. Because I think we have a generation of individuals in the Gen Z group who really have no understanding of this conflict, no history with this conflict by and large, unless you are in the region living it, who aren't old enough to remember a peace process, who aren't really old enough to remember a second intifada, who have no personal connection to terrorism, any of the things that people of my age might have studied or thought important was really just not on the radar. And then all of a sudden they're presented with pretty terrible images, which biologically speaking cause one's centers for reason to decrease in activity and one's areas of emotion to increase. And then also presented with a few syllogisms that Israel and Zionism is colonialism, it doesn't have a right to exist, and what Hamas did is perfectly legitimate and completely synonymous with Palestinian rights and ambitions for statehood. And I think that's a problem, because this is a conflict which is immensely complex and deserves the nuanced look and is really only solvable with that level of context and contextualization. So just a few other facts. I don't believe Zionism is colonialism. Zionism is very simple. It's the belief that the Jews are a people and they should have a state. Nowhere in there is a belief that the Palestinians aren't a people and shouldn't have a state. So I would just respectfully offer that, is that the idea of a Palestinian state is not otherwise at odds with the idea of a functioning Jewish state. One can recognize Palestinian ambitions, one can recognize Palestinian suffering, one can seek a solution without the destruction of the other. And I think it's important that we return to a place of comedy, of listening, of hearing each other, and working to get back on that track, as the administration is seeking to do, and understanding and being clear-eyed about the challenge. And we can talk more about some of those challenges in our remaining time, but respectfully, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
In a minute, I want to talk about the concept of integration that we were all talking about before October 7th, right? Israel's role in the Middle East. But I first want to go to Gideon and Diana. You both live in Israel, and what Gideon spoke of early on about how broadly Israelis still support the war. I want you both to provide your perspective on how, if at all, Israeli public opinion has changed since October 7th, even though there is a support. Are there deeper nuances in helping us understand Israeli public opinion about the war? Sure.
This is a great question. Look, I'm a Palestinian, and 20% of the population of Israel is like me, Palestinian. We are the people who remained in the aftermath of the Nakba, of the 1948 destruction of Palestine. And as Palestinians, you live a life where you are always a second-class citizen, because it is a Zionist state, and Zionism is racism and colonialism. And it's a state that it premises itself as providing superior rights for people who are Jewish and inferior rights for Palestinians. What does that mean now as a Palestinian living in this place and space in the aftermath of October 7th? Well, before October 7th, it was difficult because we were discriminated against. There are laws that are on the books that directly discriminate or indirectly discriminate. But it's not just laws, it's the ethos of the state. When you hear people like the finance minister saying that the only reason that we're still around is because Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job in 1948, or we're told by the Minister of Public Security that he needs to show us, the Palestinians, who the master of the house is. If you have a master, then of course you have a slave. That was before. In the aftermath, it's become totally genocidal. And what do I mean by that? It means that you see statements around the country, things like finish them, I'm not going to say the swear word that they use, Hamas, to then pictures that have morphed Palestinians into the face of Hitler, so much so that you even see signs all over the place that say, together we will succeed. And when I talk to people and ask them, what does that mean? They say to me, together we will win, together we will succeed. And I ask, what is 35,000 people being killed? Does that mean win? Am I in this together with you? And the answer is obviously no. I don't believe in genocide. I don't believe that this is the way that people should be going down. But as a Palestinian living in that country, you're forced to be always a chameleon, trying to look around to see who's going to be the next person who's going to snitch you out. There have been hundreds of people who've been thrown in prison just for speaking out against this genocide. Hundreds. And the people who are doing the snitching on them are your neighbors, your colleagues, the people in your study group. It's a society that has become completely and totally genocidal. Do they support the war? Yes, and all of the public opinion polls are showing that high percentages of Israelis are not only supporting the war, but they're supporting and saying that Israel's not using enough force, even though 15,000 kids have been killed. All of the universities have been wiped out. The largest Palestinian city, which is Gaza City, does not exist any longer. 30 of 36 hospitals have been bombed, and yet Israelis are still supporting this. Are there people who are now in favor of a ceasefire agreement? Yes, that's a different story. But those people are not the people who are saying we must stop this genocide, because the society has been completely genocidal. Why? Because the foundation of Zionism, which is the foundation of the state, is the dehumanization of Palestinians. The only way that you can create a state on my land, in my home, is to view me as being lesser and view you as being superior. And this is what Zionism is and what it has done. And this dehumanization started with Zionism through the creation of the state and continues to this very day.
Gideon, I want you to talk about the mood in Israel, but also to address, in recent days, you've seen what, at least publicly look like cracks in the government, senior ministers speaking out about the Gaza policy against the prime minister. Is that significant? Will it lead to any real change in the war strategy?
Before I answer you, just one sentence to Jonathan, and we will not open this argument here, but you should ask yourself, because supporting Zionism today means supporting Jewish supremacy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. There's no other way to explain Zionism today, not in its beginnings, today. So ask yourself if you are in favor of any kind of supremacy of one nation over the other, living together on the same piece of land, living together under the same rule, the same government, the same military occupation. But we'll open it some other time. To your question, I think Diana described very well the Israeli mood. Because time is running out, I'll be very brief about it, and then I'll answer your other question, which is important. The Israelis went out of the closet after the 7th of October. All the hidden feelings, emotions became legitimate. Most of my friends, the leftists, saw the truth all of a sudden after the 7th of October. They realized that they are all animals, and we have the right to do to them whatever we want because of what they have done on the 7th of October. This is obviously unacceptable by me and by very few other Israelis, but the shift in Israeli society was deep and maybe irreversible. It became legitimate to be racist in Israel. It became legitimate to support any kind of means against the Palestinians. it became legitimate to support any kind of war against Gaza, any kind of, nothing moves anymore the Israeli conscience. Nothing. You can tell the Israelis today about killings of hundreds and thousands of Palestinian innocent children. I mean, when you say children, you shouldn't say innocent. Every child is innocent. And nothing will move in the Israel consciousness. Nothing. It's not very hard. It used to be very hard to touch the Israelis concerning the Palestinian fate. Now it became impossible. Impossible. They are, including the leftists of yesterday, they are so convinced that what happened on the 7th legitimates everything. And I always say, look what one criminal attack did to your conscience. What should conscious Palestinians who are going through it for decades now? They had hundreds of 7th of October in their lifetimes. Do you understand now what is in their mind? But this is really whistling in the darkness. Nobody would listen to it. And now to your question. The comfort zone of the West and of most of Israeli liberals is blaming Netanyahu for everything. If we just get rid of Netanyahu, Israel will turn back into a paradise. Let us just give chance to get rid of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the demon, and if we get rid of him, then you will see what a just place we are living in. I was claiming it before, and I was very criticized before because I was misunderstood. I was described in Israel as a Bibist, as a supporter of Netanyahu. I even did the sin of attending the birthday of his wife. I admit here it was a mistake. But to claim today or to believe today that if Netanyahu will be replaced, basic things will change in Israel, no. Netanyahu must be replaced. He is terrible, he is corrupted, he lost it. I think there was a different Netanyahu a few years ago, but we can argue on this. But in any case, his time is to go home. From now on, he can only add more damages to Israel, to Palestine, to the world.
But do you think he will?
Yes?
I mean, we've heard right, the obituary on Netanyahu's political life has been written many times, right?
Yes.
And when you go to Israel these days, everyone to a person seems to say, oh, well, he's done after this. Is that true, or what is your prognostication on that?
So first of all, what I try to say that this is not the major question.
Right.
The major question is, will Israel change its policy? And I just complete this and answer you. In the most important core issues, occupation, apartheid, and continuing the war, there is no difference whatsoever between Netanyahu and all the other candidates, the possible candidates. Benny Gantz is against a Palestinian state. Yair Lapid doesn't know what he wants at all. I mean, there is no one else who will stand for a real revolutionary change. None of them. So we better low down the expectations from replacing Netanyahu. Netanyahu is an unexpected phenomena. He might survive, he might not. By a certain stage, he will have to go. The protest against him is very serious, but listen to the protests and listen carefully to the demonstrations. None of them is protesting against the war. None of them is protesting against the mass killing of children and women and innocent people. None of them is protesting against the starvation and the terrible things that happen in Gaza. They protest against two things. They want the hostages to be released, which is the most justified demand, and they want Netanyahu to go home, which is also a very justified demand. But by the end of the day, if Netanyahu will survive it or not, and there will be in a certain stage he will have to go. I can't tell you if it will be in 1 month or 1 year or 2 years. polls show that he is finished. But does it really matter? Does it really matter? You really think the occupation will be over when Netanyahu will be over? You really think that Netanyahu put the basis, the foundations to the occupation, to the apartheid? Let's remember who started all this. The big peaceniks from the Zionist left, the big peaceniks of labor.
Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You know, it's really hard to explain to people what occurred in Israel for Israelis. You know, some people have tried to explain it as, well, imagine 9/11 if you're an American. Instead of 3,000 people died, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people died. And I realize that sort of lands flat among many, particularly young people, because to them, 9/11 is history that isn't a lived experience. So it's a real challenge, but I think what people have to understand is that Israel is in a state of emotional shock and trauma, emotional paralysis, political paralysis, and where it got here is that for the last 20 years, after the collapse of the peace process, there has been a paradigm in Israel that peace may not be possible, but we can manage this conflict. And the leftist movement you referred to disappeared and took a step to the right, and the last Labor Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, there hasn't been a leftist prime minister since, and that has been the zeitgeist. And to think that that's going to change overnight in the wake of all of this shock and scar tissue and pain, I think is also fanciful, but deeply uncontextualized. But understand that there is opportunity to speak to Israelis about what is in their security interest and the interests of their neighbors, and to walk them back to a place of a new paradigm, a restoration of the paradigm of two states for two peoples. We talk about the history of 48. There was a lot of history in between which we haven't talked about. And there have been legitimate attempts and the recognition of a state of Israel, which I think with all these maximalist positions and emotional positions get roundly ignored. Netanyahu and this government is not representative of the majority of Israelis. And it is important to recognize that Israelis, by the hundreds of thousands and even millions, were in the streets protesting this government before October. It's going to be a process, it's going to take time, but ultimately, leaders can lead and demonstrate to people and speak to them and meet them on their own terms with compassion, rahmanis, that there is a new way possible. But again, understand the trauma. Every day people wake up and yes, there are all sorts of signs, but primarily the signs are get our people home. Everyone is in a state of constant pain. It is still October 7th for so many people. 100,000 people are displaced from their homes. There is immense shame that this was allowed to happen. There's anger at the government. There's anger at the world for not understanding. There's more anger at the government for not effectively articulating. And it's easy to point at some of the most radical members of the government who are largely detested by the Israeli body politic and try to explain that that is representative of Israeli views, Israeli culture, Israeli identity. And it's simply not true.
When will we care about the Palestinian trauma? I mean, really, how much can we talk about the Israeli trauma and ignore the trauma of 2.3 million people in Gaza whose destiny is uncomparable to the big trauma which the Israelis went through? Yes, they went through a trauma. And last sentence, this conference is dedicated to questions of security. Had you ever discussed the security of the Palestinians? When it comes to security, it's always security of Israel. What about the security of the people of Gaza, who is no one in the world who protects them? What about them? What about their security? And what about their trauma? It's about time to see also the other, and not always to concentrate about our suffer, which is a suffer, But we are not alone, for God's sake.
Rami,
Sorry.
Rami, you want to speak, and then I also want to ask Miriam a question about something she said earlier on. But go ahead, Rami.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I'm not going to answer Jonathan's main approach because I think it represents the kind of approach that we've heard from Israel and Zionism, which I argue is now collapsing because it just doesn't have much validity in the world in the face of what the Palestinians have suffered. But so I'm not going to touch on that. But 2 points, technical points. He mentioned that Zionism is a beautiful thing for the Jewish people, which of course it is when it was founded in the 1880s and 1890s when Jews in Russia were being treated like animals. So the idea of a Jewish state is perfectly reasonable if there's an empty piece of land where they don't displace another people, but that wasn't the case. When Zionism combined with British imperialism, that's when the problem started, and it was written into the legal documents that formed the birth certificate of Israel, the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate of 1922-23, which explicitly talk about a Jewish state and don't mention the Palestinians. They say the non-Jewish residents of the region. So that's one point. The other point is, he mentioned that all this talk about resistance and fighting and destroy Israel. We're not out to destroy Israel. The Arab countries have all recognized Israel, made an offer to recognize Israel. Hamas has made 6 offers to the Israelis to live in peace with them in a West Bank state if UN resolutions are implemented. So we are not genocidal. We are out for equal rights. And we've tried to push this argument for generations, as Miriam has said, but our approach hasn't worked because the world doesn't take us seriously. And the 2 greatest imperial powers of the 20th century, the British and then the Americans, supported the initial political and philosophical genocide of Zionism, which has said, let's create our state here on somebody else's land, where there was a 5% indigenous Jewish minority that always lived there. And then the American state comes in after World War II and keeps supporting it as it's doing now. So just those 2 points I wanted to make clear. We have clearly, repeatedly told the Israelis we are prepared to live in peace with you, but only on the basis of equal rights and resolving the refugeehood and statelessness of the Palestinians as put in international law and documents and resolutions, and negotiated to the satisfaction of both sides, which means the refugee issue will be resolved in a way that doesn't destroy Israel. So I think these are important points to keep in mind. And at some point, a coalition of global forces and powers is going to come together and come to the region with the Israelis and the Palestinians and the others and push them and force them into some kind of process where they both enjoy guarantees that they're not going to be wiped out, like the Palestinians are being wiped out now.
Miriam, hi. I wanted to ask you a question, and because it's been a while since you've been able to talk, but you can answer my question, then say what else you want to say. But I want to challenge you a little bit on something you said in the beginning, that in some ways it was a good thing that the international media wasn't in Gaza covering the war, because in your mind it had had a sort of effect of having I don't want to put words in your mouth, it was less filtered, right, than with the media. But maybe here I am as the defender and representative of the legacy media up on the stage. Isn't it not better, in wartime especially, to have as many people as possible covering what's going on? Not one type of media, a newer type of media versus another, to make sure it is as comprehensive as possible, and doesn't the social media that you talk about, rightly as being so powerful, have its own distorting effect at times because of who chooses to view it? I wanted to just press you on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, I wanted to just make one addition. There is now a concerted effort to force the Israelis to come to the table and see the Palestinians as equals. by one global movement, which is the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And it is a peaceful movement. It is very assertive. It has, and I think nobody mentioned this, its invigoration is one of the results of what happened in October, to really peacefully but assertively force change that may or may not affect Israeli public opinion. Hopefully it will, because it's not won with guns. And as I said, I think all of us here are trying to affect change through peaceful means. And I think that is the most brilliant one, the most brilliant idea. Briefly about the media. Look, I've covered the last 30 years of wars in the Middle East, and I want to particularly just mention the 2003 war on Iraq, where I worked for Western media, and I was asked twice to basically fabricate news. I was able to avoid it, and I'm not saying all Western media fabricates. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying it's very important to have context, to have reporters that have context, that have knowledge of language, geography, and the conflict when reporting this. And I've never seen something so comprehensive as I saw in the coverage of Gaza. There's always going to be some distortion. And I do hope that the international media will be able to go in and report. But I did not see it as the great disaster. In fact, I thought it was a good thing that people on the ground were able to give their own perspectives for a change. Because a lot of Western media doesn't let the native speak. The Western media often speaks on behalf of the native, and therein lies the problem.
Can I ask Gideon about the Israeli press and the Israeli media since October 7th and covering this war? You represent a very powerful member of the Israeli press. One of the most prominent is Haaretz. Are Haaretz readers representative of most Israelis?
Diana is laughing, and that's the real reaction, and the inevitable reaction. You do very good, and I mean, Haaretz is really the difference and maybe the only Israeli newspaper. But I'm not here to praise Haaretz, which I'm so proud to be part of for so many years. But the Israeli media as a media reached in this war its lowest, and I would use even sharper words, its most criminal role ever. It was the big betray of Israeli media in its professional mission. The average Israeli didn't see and didn't read anything about what's going on in Gaza. Nothing. Israeli media is now 8 months in an orgy of victimization, of showing our victims, which should be shown obviously, with support to the hostages, which deserve all kinds of support, with their families, with the families of the killed ones. All this the media should do, absolutely, no doubt about it. But totally hiding the punishment of Gaza, totally hiding the sacrifice of Gaza, totally hiding the suffer, the dying children on the floors of hospitals, the starvation, the uprooted people. Nothing of this you can see in Israel. And I truly believe, because I believe the Israelis, at least part of them, are people of conscience, if they would have just see more, they don't want to see, sure, and therefore the media doesn't bother to show them, because the media knows very well what they want to get and what they don't want to get. But a professional media does not act like a you know, that everyone can order whatever he wants. No, it has a mission, and the mission is to tell the whole story, and the Israeli media is betraying it, and this betray has many political and moral consequences, because the Israelis feel so good about themselves, even now, partly because the media enable them to feel good, because it hides the real story and the real reality. And this, in my view, in historical terms, is criminal.
So that is going to have to be the last word. The big red clock is telling us our time is up. But I want to thank our panelists for a very lively discussion and hopefully bringing some light and heat to this very complex topic. So thank you.